Hello, I'm back from GameholeCon where I dealt with traps, and I wanted to do a video talking about how the 2024 Dungeon Master's Guide has changed in regards to traps, because this was something that came up with all the folks who attended my sessions. So at GameholeCon, I was really, I wanted to try something kind of wild, and I was very pleased, really happy to see how it went. I decided to do a kind of combination seminar about traps, but also game. So we had 12 players gather around a table, and they would try out walking through a trap-filled gauntlet room that comes from the Dungeon of Doom. I used the Dwarven Forge terrain and the adventure that I wrote for Dwarven Forge, which you can get free at their website. And I led people through a trap-filled dungeon to talk about trap design. And I had been fortunate that as a creator, I received an advanced copy of the Dungeon Master's Guide for 2024. And it's a really cool book. So I might make a couple videos talking about some of the things I really like. But it's really interesting to compare, for me as a designer, compare what has changed between 2014 and 2024 and why they might have done this and what this kind of does to our game. With traps, it's also cool because traps have evolved really wildly over the years. So like if I look at this nice copy of the original Dungeons and Dragons, original OD&D as we call it, the original Dungeons and Dragons set, this box set has inside of it 3 little booklets. And one of them is this guy, the Underworld and Wilderness Adventures. And the very first trap, you could argue, maybe in Dungeons and Dragons, appears in this picture. It's actually a tie between the pit and a false door. And if you go on and read what this kind of example dungeon has in terms of traps, well, it's kind of fun because the traps are all about obfuscation. They're about confusing the player and making them think that there may be somewhere else in the dungeon, right? So for example, you go through a one-way door and now you can't come back. Or you go down a ramp and you don't know it's a ramp. It feels like level ground, but you're going down, down, down. And back then, things got harder when you went lower in a dungeon. So you're actually going to a more dangerous area without knowing. And that was kind of the types of traps you get. But we don't have to wait too long because the Greyhawk supplement comes out. And as I shared with folks during the seminar, the Greyhawk supplement has a bunch of pages or 2 pages actually, of trap ideas. And they're kind of cool. Like they are things like soap bubbles that you can break open, or maybe they'll kind of grab you. You can find a gem in one of them and maybe something else. Or there's a force field around the treasure and you can pull levers in the room to remove that force field, but it might also do really terrible stuff too. And they don't really tell you what, they just give you that idea of like, hey, pull the lever, bad things might happen, enjoy. And though we get these kinds of more imaginative, creative, funhouse type traps, and that's kind of an advancement from even that original box set, we get a dungeon in it, in the Blackmore supplement, the first dungeon arguably for D&D, the first one published by TSR that's official. In the Blackmore supplement, there is a dungeon called Temple of the Frog. And it's got a lot of weird design choices that kind of show you how things were back then. But the traps are all things like you mess with a chest and the owners show up. Just mess with the chest, owners show up. It's almost like punishment, right? Or there's a secret door and you open it and behind it are 10 to 100 rats. So the point of all this is that we've come a long way in trap design. And so, every few years, people kind of change their minds. If you look back and look at the history of traps, you go, oh yeah, we've come a long way from that, or Grimtooth traps, these kinds of Rube Goldberg traps that like one thing leads to another and all of it is just pain for the characters. Gotcha feeling, right? Ha, spear trap got you in the face. Do you want to keep going down this corridor? And you're like, okay, I guess. So that's kind of what's going on here. When I look at the 2024 DMG and I look at the traps section, I'm like, okay, how have we changed our approach to traps? Well, let's find out. So what I've got on the screen right now is the D&D Beyond version of the 2014 DMG, right? So this wonderful book right here. And you can hear actually on the Mastering Dungeons podcast, Sean Merwin and I go over this book in detail, chapter by chapter, of what we like, what we'd change, and what we guessed might happen in 2024. So now I really get to see kind of where were we on what the designers agreed on what should change or should not. And traps is one where I thought, maybe there isn't that much to do. I mean, they work pretty well, and there's actually really good guidance. It also includes, some really cool art, like this really sweet, I love this. It's one of my favorites of just the idea of like this wizard trying to reach out to grab this thing, and all these blades are going to respond. I actually put that in the Dungeon of Doom as a sort of inspired by this, which I think is a lot of fun. And then there's just like a picture of a chest, and that's really it. So if we kind of scroll through here, you can see there's a lot of words, a lot of guidance here on triggering a trap and detecting a trap, and general guidance around traps, skills to use and at different points. Trap effects. We get 2 tables that tell us how to build a trap, which is kind of cool. And then a section of what's called complex traps, and then sample traps that we can use in our games that all have kind of statistics woven into the structure of what's there in the words. And you can see there's a bunch of traps there, right? So pretty cool. And all of this in the actual pages, it takes up a total of 4 pages. So what is there in 2024? Well, I can't quite show you. All I have is a digital version. I don't have I don't have the paper version quite yet, but I've looked at it. And what I can tell you is that we are still at 4 pages, but there's more art and there's bigger font. And that means fewer words. You probably guessed that. If you've heard us on Mastering Dungeons, the 2024 Player's Handbook for all of the advertising of Biggest Ever has fewer words. I haven't done the math on the DMG yet, but at least in this section, same pages, fewer words. So what is it that happens? Well, you've got to collapse down and make it a little sweeter for what you get. And there's some really nice things to the 24 DMG. So let's look at that. So what is gone from the 2024 DMG? A lot of guidance. I mean, it's not that many words, but there are important words that I actually would have wanted more of. I wanted to see more words talking about how to use traps, when, how to make them great. Like that's a lot of the stuff that I covered in the seminar is when do you add traps and what kind of traps and what's the role, what's the point of a trap, right? Like what do players want out of it? What do DMs want out of it? How do we make them engaging and interesting and occupy everyone's attention span and be pleasing to everybody? That there is even less of. And it's more, I think the concept for 24 is learn by seeing the examples we give you. Gone are sections on triggering, detecting, and disabling traps, where in 2014, that was what carried the bulk of the rules around interacting with traps, right? Oh, if it's a magical trap, you can use Arcana, but it's, this kind of skill and so on, which was a little confusing in 2014. So I would have liked the guidance here to then be clear, and we'll talk about what 24 does in a second. Gone is also a section on making traps interesting. It was brief, but at least it was there trying to speak to you a bit. And if we look at Xanathar's, that source book, which was part of the 2014 rule set, Xanathar's has a whole bunch of discussion on making traps interesting and cool, and we lose all of that. I find that particularly interesting because at the D&D Summit and in some videos after that, the D&D team discussed that they were taking material from Xanathar's and from Tasha's and bringing it into the core books, which would require to republish those 2 books because so much of that good stuff was being brought in. Here, I don't see that good stuff. We just kind of don't have it. And this may sound overly critical. Again, we're going to get to what's cool about the DMG 2024. Don't worry, there is good stuff. And overall, I do really like the DMG 2024. But I'm being critical and analytical, let's say, more analytical than critical, looking at the design of it, right? So what is also gone? The distinction between a mechanical trap and a magical trap, that doesn't exist anymore in 2024. They're just traps, but they may reflect these kinds of old paradigms. It's just not a keyword anymore. Also seemingly gone are complex traps, which was really a big push in Xanathar's. We got a lot of examples of complex traps. And in the DMG, we had in 2014 discussion that said that a complex trap is one that acts every round in your initiative, right? Versus a simple one is a spear trap that, say, fires once and it's done. If the spear trap reloads and keeps on firing every round until you shut it off, that's a complex trap and it will be an initiative. There's no guidance about that. So nothing really tells you, hey, you can have a trap that does this. You just have to look at their examples. Speaking of examples, gone is the Sphere of Annihilation as a example trap. That one's been removed. Not there. Bye-bye, says 24. Also in Xanathars, one of the cool things we got slightly different tables, and we got a spell equivalent by level table. And this is really useful. So I have a spreadsheet that I give to folks on my Patreon that has a bunch of tools that are really useful for designing. And one of the things I do is mention this spell equivalent by level chart, because it shows at different tiers what a spell can be, what level a spell can be in a trap to cause an effect that is kind of fair per the rules. And that's gone, which I thought, man, that is a great table to tell a DM, hey, it's not just about damage. You can have spell effects like charming or whatever it is, suggestion spell, any number of things, bless as a boon or bane as a hindrance. That's gone. So we don't know that anymore unless we go to Xanathars, right? It wasn't brought forward from Xanathars, which I would have liked. Okay, so let's talk about what's changed. The first big thing is there used to be these two tables showing you how traps behave across level. That has become a single table, which is cool and a good example of consolidation, saving space, simplifying. It's fine. But to make that possible, what they've done is removed one of the categories of traps. So traps used to come as setbacks, dangerous, or deadly. And those are sort of the three concepts of why you'd use a trap, or when you're designing it, how you would say, like, oh, I want it to just be a momentary setback, or I want it to have some real danger, or, oh, this might kill you. So now there is nuisance and deadly. And what they've done differs on whether you look at the damage, attacks, or saves, which sometimes have changed. So basically what they did is they took the damage of the setback traps and made those nuisance. They took the damage of dangerous traps and made those deadly. And the damage of the old 2014 deadly traps is no longer in the game. So we've toned down the damage a bit, which, if you think of characters getting stronger in 2024, arguably true. Well, their damaging is their hit points are not going to be reduced by traps. But hit points are one things that haven't really increased for 2024 characters, so maybe that's okay. I would argue that traps hit really hard in 2014, and so I think this is actually design-wise a good move. Deadly traps were really, really deadly and tended to not be fun. More fun is a trap that deals some damage and takes away from how strong you are, and then you go on to a combat where you really deal with things. Or it's a trap in a combat and it's contributing to the damage, and again does not need to be really strong. In fact, can be lower than even that setback or nuisance level. So I'm overall good for this. The damage being toned down, just two categories, that's fine. When it comes to attacks and saving throws, what they've actually done is sort of split the difference between these three tables. So sort of the numbers tend to be the numbers that were given for setback and dangerous and deadly were ranges. And now we're kind of in between where those ranges would overlap between the three. That becomes where attacks and saving throws come from. So sort of in between setback and dangerous as nuisance, in between deadly and dangerous is now the deadly in 2024. That's probably fine, though I think sometimes the saves didn't need to be much softer and the attacks didn't need to be much softer. I think it's good when traps can deal what they're supposed to deal, especially if we've toned down the damage, but it's okay. And hey, you can change it at your table pretty easily. I think that we'll find traps in adventures will sort of reflect what's needed for them and then may not adhere to this perfectly. Another change is the trap keywords. The trap stat blocks are sort of like paragraph of a trap in 2014 would say if it's mechanical or magical. That's now gone, as I said. So what you now see is whether it is a nuisance or deadly, so that you know that as part of the trap. Kind of cool. Now, I will say that if you look at traps in the 2014 book, that isn't what you actually end up seeing as a sort of stat block in adventure text. So it may not matter anyway, because it's not like you saw traps saying magical, mechanical in an adventure often. It would just sort of describe that there was a pit trap or a spear trap, and it would just give you the information needed to run it. So this may not matter at all. I don't expect that kind of formatting necessarily to carry forward into adventures. But those keywords did change. The big change, and it's awesome when we really get to like, why would you want 2024 for the trap section? It's a little simpler in terms of the table, but what's really cool is every example trap there, and they're all there except for the Sphere of Annihilation from the 2014 to 2024. They all come across except for one, and you get a level 1 to 4 trap. Okay, so all the traps are for levels 1 to 4 ready to go. And then you get a table at the end of each example trap that tells you, hey, what is this going to look like 5 to 10 and so on, right? All the tiers are giving their damages and DC changes, so you can absolutely just grab that and insert it into the text, and boom, you are ready to go. Awesome. There's just one little catch, and that is that while the DCs for your saving throw and the attacks and the damage, those are scaling, the other parts of a trap are not scaling. So let's look at some examples. If you like success in RPGs, I hope that you'll consider joining our Patreon community. There, you can be part of our Discord community. We discuss the latest happenings in the industry. We share each other's work and progress. We analyze what is taking place in the hobby and look at the latest products and events. I hope also that you'll come join me on alphastream.org, join the mailing list. You get a free product for joining, and you can see all that I've been creating lately. Thanks so much for supporting my work. So let's start with the collapsing roof, which is the first one in both 2014 and 2024. This was a DC 10 to spot, a DC 15 to disable, and a DC 15 dex save where you take 22 or 40-10 damage. Now, that damage is what corresponds to the level 5 to 10 table, and we get a lower version for our 1 to 4 games, or 1 to 4 level characters. So that's the damage and saving throw that we get. That carries across, no real change. But what's now interesting is detect and disarm are kind of in italics as a section that you look at. And it's the same regardless. There's no table for it. So no matter what level your characters are, you get a DC 11 Wisdom Perception check to see whether you detect that there is a tripwire that's going to cause the roof to cave down on you, right? So interesting that part is not scaling, right? Some folks like to argue that the world should have like an inner real logic, right? Like a lock is a lock no matter what. It doesn't get harder as your character's level. And in this case, we see some of that is true. Like finding a tripwire is just DC 11 Wisdom Perception, according to this trap. And it doesn't matter what level you are or how dangerous this dungeon is, the tripwire is apparently made of the exact same material and is no more invisible or visible. But the damage of the trap, that scales based on the level of the characters. You may or may not like that. Obviously you can change it, but it's interesting the approach that is taken here where that is a static thing, right? Wisdom, the perception, the detect disable, that part is flat. That I think is really easy. Oh, and one last thing that's really critical. Before we had a DC 15 check to disable it and a DC 10 to spot. Now it's DC 11 to spot it. No check to cut it once you spot it. And there are a couple of traps in here that are like that, which I found really interesting because to me, I love traps to have a sort of two-step engagement. And if this video were just about building traps, one of the things I'd say is, hey, try to do 2 steps. Step 1, you see something's off. Step 2, you realize what's off and you deal with it. And that's kind of your engagement that's going on in the session, which I think is really cool. Like that's really cool, fun play to be kind of interacting in that way, right? We can also look at the fire-breathing statue because this has changed a fair amount as well. Before, the DC 15 perception check was for spotting a pressure plate and some scorch marks, right? So that kind of tells you what's going on. You spot it, you know the kind of thing that's coming out of this statue, you get it. Now we get a discussion about magic. If you cast Detect Magic, you're going to find an aura. Then, if we're going to use the search action, which is introduced in 2024 in the player's handbook, each creature within 5 feet of the statue can make that search action, which is already interesting that you're letting multiple people roll. That makes it very easy. And all you've got to get is a DC 10 perception check, wisdom perception. If you succeed, you see a glyph on a statue. Now, if you did that, you can take the study action, and with a DC 15 intelligence arcana check, you know that the glyph represents fire. And now you can deface the glyph, scratch it out, with no check to disarm it. Right? I mean, that's really interesting. So we've done a kind of two-step here, but it's really just about sort of finding it and discovering it, not disabling it. And I think that's really interesting because to me, one of the fun things about traps is spotlighting the person who disables it, which is usually a rogue. Here we're kind of saying the disabling is really easy, and it's just about seeing it. And that probably isn't the rogue, right? The best intelligent arcana, the best wisdom perception is probably not your rogue. I don't know. I don't know about that. The other thing we get is a search action with a DC 15 wisdom perception check can find the pressure plate. Wedging something in, no check at all, can then prevent that pressure plate from triggering. And that's a really interesting change. There's some other traps that have this kind of wording too. So how do I feel about this? So I wish there had been clear guidance as to what they intend to be a good way of using the rules in play to make for cool traps, right? Like, why is there a trap? What's the point of it? So therefore, what's the interaction between player and DM? That isn't really spelled out. But what's gone is this lack of clarity about when it's investigation and when it's perception. If you use the examples of all of these and kind of draw your own conclusions, which I'm going to do right now for you. So if you could look around the room and see a thing, so like that fire-breathing statue, right? We can see that there is a glyph that is inscribed on the statue itself. So because we can see it, it's there to be seen, even if it's tiny, that is a wisdom perception check or the study action. Is that right? Search action. Sorry, boy, those words are too similar. So if we do a search action and wisdom perception check, we can spot that glyph is there. We then may need a secondary check like intelligence arcana to know what that glyph is, though if all you can do is scratch it off, I'd argue you don't even need that, but let's go with it. So intelligence arcana as a secondary engagement piece. Now we know it's a fire glyph and that it's safe to just rub it out and it's done there. Okay, but I like the consistency of this because what we also find is when there's something that you can't just see, right? Like you would have to mess with it to figure it out. Like if the pressure plate were so well hidden that you can't just look at it and spot it, you've got to test it. Now we get that it's intelligence investigation to do that. Just as with the intelligence arcana, that is going to be our study action, right? So search for perception when something is obvious. Study action for either intelligence arcana or intelligence investigation. We've got to really probe, test, figure things out as to what it does. That's cool. To me, that becomes very transparent as to how to build traps, how to adjudicate traps. You can do things on the fly really well with just the table and those concepts. You can roll off of it. A little less clear is this idea of, and I guess from a guidance perspective, right? It's less clear as to whether it's fun to have traps that you can just say like, okay, you figured out what it does. You can just cut the cord or you can, scratch out the glyph. Now it's perfectly safe to go by. I think there's really neat tension in the disable check. I think that's a really neat thing where your rogue or mage has to try to use arcana to counter it or something like that. I think that's cool. It creates a tension point and the whole party's watching to see what the one player is going to do and whether they're going to succeed. And they go, yeah, I did it, right? That element of danger, I think, is a lot better than when it's just about finding the trap. But that may just be, how I see it and doesn't necessarily reflect it. But it's a big change in what we're saying to DMs. Overall, I think for the better. Search and study are now more reliable based on these guidelines. How traps work are a little better. One thing that doesn't get super addressed is passive scores. So if I have a passive perception of something really high, do I just see all these traps for which there are examples here? Do I see all those things? Now, maybe I still need to do intelligence arcana or investigation or something like that to deal with it, or a disable check, but it doesn't really tell you that. And I think the 2024 Player's Handbook was a little silent on passive scores as well. So you're going to have to decide how you want to work with it. Advice I generally give, not in this book, not in the old book, not in the new book, I generally try to say, it's cool to have some things that you can see that tell you something's up, right? There are scorch marks around the statue. Cool. Now everybody's like worried, right? And then somebody like the rogue's going to go in and make intelligence investigation checks. That's when they find the pressure plate. Now they make a disable check to put something underneath it and stop it. That's how I would generally run it. I wouldn't make it like, oh yeah, there's a pressure plate, you can easily stop it. Nah, I would give it some extra tension there. But that's how I would work with it. And I think with the framework of 2024, it's easier to do that in a reliable way that players can expect, right? The expectations between you as DM and them as players can be a little clearer. So something else worth noting is how things have changed due to Xanathars. So if we look at the text of the Xanathar's book, where it revisits traps in chapter 2, we get a lot of ideas of what a simple trap should be, how to make them meaningful, how to run them. Example simple traps. These are all traps that don't show up in 2024. The bear trap, the crossbow trap, the portcullis, the fiery blast, net trap, scything blade, poison needle. There are all kinds of different traps here. And it talks about your purpose of a trap, how they're going to be seen, all these kinds of concepts, the lethality. It gives you that spell equivalent by level that I talked about. Triggers, right? Just there's a lot of text here talking through how to handle traps. And then complex traps with all of these ideas around a trap that's going to be ongoing round after round. And it gives you a bunch of examples. The Path of Blades. It has the Sphere of Crushing Doom, where it keeps rolling around and going after you. The Poison Tempest. So we get a lot of examples, and then another whole section on designing complex traps. So it's worth remembering that all of this is there. So if you want to build traps and you're really interested in it, opening up your Xanathars may still be helpful as you think through that. And you think through the idea of traps that have initiatives to them and how that can be dynamic and added in there. I mentioned the Dungeon of Doom by Dwarven Forge. If you want some examples of traps that are ongoing and interact with you, both passive, simple traps and complex traps, there are lots of those in there where they become a big feature of the play experience in an encounter, whether or not there are other monsters in there to deal with. All right, so let's wrap up. 2024 DMG overall, when it comes to traps, they are simpler. The traps are scaling, which is super awesome. Great approach to make this table for every single trap so you can use these traps in a wide variety of adventures, the entire 1 to 20 level experience. You can drop in these traps really easily, which also allows us to think about how to make other traps like them scale. That's great. There's far less guidance. That is the one big downside. So it's still worth it to read the old 2014 DMG or Xanathars especially and get that guidance. Come to my trap seminar at Game Hall. I would have loved to have seen more here. There is unfortunately less. But what we can do and counters that is this clarity through the examples they provide of what the skills are doing. As long as they continue to agree with what's in this book does have a very clear pattern of the idea of searching versus studying, right? Can you see the thing? Then it's probably the search action with perception. Do you need to test it because it's not just easily visible? Well, then it's investigation and study. Or if it's magical, it's the study action again, but instead of investigation, you're using intelligence arcana, right? So that kind of guidance becomes, I think, really good for the game to have that clarity. That and the scaling traps make this overall, for me, a big win. I like what 2024 does for DMG. I just want that guidance to be there. But I guess that's the job of those of us who provide guidance for DMs. We can write our blog entries and so on talking about that. But hopefully this leads to better traps being created in official products and in third-party products. We shall see. I hope you enjoyed. If you like this, please give this thing the like, give it the thumbs up, sign up for notifications, and support me by going to alphastream.org. Thanks so much.